The Kythera had ruled the galaxy for over 3,000 years through pure, unrelenting violence. Standing 9 feet tall with razor-sharp claws that could slice through starship hull plating, they were evolution's perfect killing machines wrapped in armored hide that could deflect plasma bolts. Their 6 eyes could track multiple targets simultaneously, while their triple-jointed limbs moved with deadly precision that made them nightmares in close combat. War Prime. Docthel surveyed the latest conquest reports from his command throne. Aboard the dreadnought, Bloodhunter, 17 civilizations had fallen to Kythera forces in the past solar cycle. Their populations either enslaved or consumed, according to ancient Kythera tradition. The galaxy trembled at the sound of Kythera war drums, and for good reason no species in recorded history had ever successfully resisted their expansion. The war reports detailed the systematic destruction of the Villani Republic, a technologically advanced civilization that had foolishly attempted to negotiate with Kythera diplomats. The Villani had offered tribute, territory, even voluntary servitude. But the Kythera had no interest in anything except total domination through overwhelming force. Their cities burned for weeks while Kythera warriors hunted the survivors through. The ruins, Commander Velkin, Zachthel's most trusted lieutenant, approached the throne with intelligence gathered from the Outer Rim territories. His scarred hide bore the marks of 100 battles, and his missing left eye had been lost during the conquest of the Astral Confederacy. The datapad in his clawed hands contained information about a species that had recently begun expanding. Beyond their home system, War Prime, our scouts have detected a new species establishing colonies in the Terran sector. Velkin reported with the casual tone of a predator discussing potential prey. They call themselves humans. Initial analysis suggests they possess moderate technological capabilities, but lack any significant military infrastructure. Zachthal studied the holographic displays showing human colonial expansion patterns. The creatures were small, fragile-looking beings with soft skin and no natural weapons. Their ships were crude by galactic standards, relying on primitive fusion drives and basic energy weapons. Most amusing of all, they appeared to be attempting peaceful contact with other species in their region. The intelligence reports painted a picture of a species that seemed almost designed to be prey for the Kythera war machine. Humans showed no evidence of the biological enhancements that serious military species employed. They lacked the armored hide of the Kythera, the regenerative abilities of the Zephyrians, or the hive mind coordination that made the Nexus swarm so dangerous. In battle, they are attempting to establish trade relationships with minor species in their vicinity, Velkin continued, his mandibles clicking in what passed for Kythera laughter. Their diplomatic overtures include offers of technology exchange and cultural cooperation. They appear to believe that warfare can be avoided through mutual understanding. The concept of avoiding warfare through diplomacy was so alien to Kythera, thinking that it bordered on the incomprehensible. For 3 millennia, the Kythera had solved every problem through the application of overwhelming violence. Diplomacy was what prey species attempted when they realized they were too weak. To fight effectively, Zachthal activated the tactical display showing Kythera fleet positions throughout the galaxy. Thousands of warships maintained control over conquered territories, while hunter-killer squadrons roamed the outer regions seeking new targets. The Kythera military machine was a perfectly efficient engine of destruction that had consumed civilizations spanning millions of star systems. The human colonies would provide an interesting diversion from the recent conquests of more advanced civilizations. The Kythera warriors had grown restless during the systematic destruction of the Hegemony Alliance. Those battles had required more patience than skill. Human settlements would offer opportunities for the kind of close-quarters combat that Kythera fighters preferred. Prepare Hunter Squadron Gamma for reconnaissance operations in human space, Zachthel commanded. I want detailed intelligence on their military capabilities, population centers, and industrial infrastructure. We will add their worlds to our territory within 6 lunar cycles. The orders rippled through the Kythera command structure with mechanical efficiency. Hunter Squadron Gamma consisted of 12 stealth corvettes crewed by the most experienced Kythera scouts in the fleet. Their mission was to gather intelligence while remaining undetected. allowing the main invasion force to strike with perfect tactical advantage. Velkin reviewed the preliminary data on human military forces with professional interest. Warprime. Their largest warships appear to be converted civilian vessels equipped with mining lasers and missile systems designed for asteroid clearance. Their ground forces carry kinetic projectile weapons and wear armor that wouldn't protect against Cathora claws. The technological assessment confirmed what Zachthel had suspected from the initial reports. Humans were a young species that had not yet learned the harsh realities of galactic warfare. They still believed that conflicts could be resolved through negotiation rather than the systematic elimination of weaker opponents the Cathera had encountered. Similar naive civilizations throughout their expansion across the galaxy, the pattern was always the same. Initial diplomatic overtures followed by desperate attempts at military resistance. And finally, the inevitable surrender when the prey species realized they were completely outmatched. Within days of first contact with Cathora forces, Zachthal dismissed Velkin with instructions to begin standard pre-conquest preparations. The Cathora war machine would descend upon human space like a force of nature, sweeping aside their pathetic defenses and adding another species to the long list of civilizations that had fallen before Kithra's superiority. The Warprime settled back in his command throne, already anticipating the satisfaction of watching human cities burn. In his 3 centuries of military service, he had never encountered a species that could present a meaningful challenge to Cathera might. The humans would be no different from the hundreds of other civilizations that had learned too late that the galaxy belonged to the strong, as the Blood Hunter continued its patrol through conquered space. Zachthal reviewed tactical plans that had proven successful against dozens of different species. The Cathera approach to warfare was brutally simple. Identify the enemy's weaknesses, overwhelm their defenses, and eliminate any possibility of organized resistance. Against humans, the strategy would be even more straightforward than Hunter Squadron Gamma approached the outer edge of human space with the confidence of predators who had never encountered effective resistance. Commander Vexstar led the stealth reconnaissance mission from his Corvette Shadowbane, confident that the primitive humans would never detect their approach. The squadron's advanced cloaking technology had allowed them to observe dozens of civilizations without ever being discovered. The first human colony they encountered was New Darwin, farming settlement on a world that barely qualified as habitable by galactic standards. The colonists had transformed barren soil into productive agricultural land through techniques that seemed to involve more determination than advanced technology. Vexstar studied the settlement through his ship's sensors, noting the complete absence of defensive installations. Target analysis complete, reported Scout Leader Crixtal from the sensor station. Population approximately 50,000 humans spread across multiple agricultural sites. No orbital defenses, no military garrison, no evidence of weapons manufacturing. Their largest structures appear to be grain storage facilities. The intelligence confirmed everything the Cathora had expected about human military preparedness. The colonists went about their daily routines completely unaware that they were being observed by scouts from the galaxy's most feared military force. Children played in settlements that could be reduced to ash within minutes of a Kithra assault. Vexstar ordered the squadron to maintain surveillance distance while they cataloged human defensive capabilities. The corvettes spread out across the system, their sensors analyzing everything from communication networks to industrial capacity. What they discovered was almost laughably inadequate by Kithra military standards. The human defense fleet for the entire system consisted of 3 patrol boats that appeared to be civilian vessels with basic weapon systems bolted to their hulls. The ships conducted routine patrols on predictable schedules, broadcasting their positions openly on communication channels that weren't even encrypted. Their crews seemed more concerned with search and rescue operations than military preparedness. Commander, we're detecting communication traffic between this colony and other human settlements, Crixtal reported. They're discussing agricultural yields, trade agreements, and cultural exchange programs. There's no mention of military preparedness or defense planning. The naivety was almost endearing in its completeness. Human colonies were sharing information about their resources, population levels, and industrial capabilities over open communication channels. They were essentially providing detailed intelligence packages to anyone capable of intercepting their transmissions. The squadron moved deeper into human space, observing colony after colony that displayed the same pattern of peaceful development and military unpreparedness. The humans were building infrastructure for long-term settlement and growth, apparently never considering that more aggressive species might view their expansion as a threat or an opportunity. Vextar's reconnaissance reached its most important phase when the squadron approached Earth itself, the human homeworld. The planet was a blue-green jewel surrounded by orbital installations that seemed focused on peaceful purposes rather than military defense. Space elevators carried cargo to and from the surface, while massive solar collectors powered what appeared to be a thriving civilian economy. The defensive installations protecting Earth were more numerous than those around the colonies, but still pathetically inadequate by Cthulhu standards. A handful of space stations, armed with missile systems and energy weapons that might have been effective against pirates or raiders. The human fleet defending their homeworld consisted of, perhaps, 200 ships, most of which appeared to be converted civilian vessels. "This is almost insulting," muttered Vextar as he reviewed the tactical data. "They've had enough time to colonize dozens of star systems, but they've never bothered to build a military worthy of the name. Do they believe the galaxy is populated entirely by peaceful traders?" The reconnaissance mission expanded to include human industrial capabilities and population centers. The data revealed a species that had focused their development on scientific research, its cultural advancement, and economic growth, while virtually ignoring the military technologies that every successful galactic civilization required for survival. Crystal discovered the most revealing intelligence while monitoring human educational institutions. "Commander, their military academies teach something called ethics of warfare and minimizing civilian casualties. They appear to believe that conflicts should be fought according to rules that protect non-combatants." The concept of ethical warfare was so foreign to Cthulhu, thinking that Vextar had to review the translation software to ensure he was understanding correctly. The idea that military force should be constrained by moral considerations rather than maximized for effectiveness was a luxury that only species protected by stronger neighbors could afford. The squadron completed their reconnaissance after observing human activities for several weeks. The intelligence they gathered painted a picture of a species that was either remarkably naive about galactic realities or protected by some hidden advantage that wasn't immediately apparent. Vextar chose to believe the former explanation. The return journey to Cthulhu space gave Vextar time to compile his final report for War Prime Zaxthal. The assessment was devastating in its implications for human survival. They possessed no significant military capabilities, no defensive strategies adequate for serious warfare, and no apparent understanding of the threats that existed in the galaxy beyond their borders.
Recommended conquest timeline. Immediate, Vextar wrote in his tactical summary. Human resistance will be minimal and can be overcome through standard assault protocols. Estimated campaign duration.
Cycles for complete territorial control. Additional to cycles for population processing. The intelligence package included detailed star charts showing the locations of every human colony, complete tactical analyses of their defensive capabilities, and recommendations for the most efficient conquest strategies. The humans had made the reconnaissance mission almost effortless by broadcasting so much information about themselves. As Hunter Squadron Gamma approached the Cthulhu Fleet assembly point, Vextar felt the satisfaction of a professional warrior who had completed a successful mission. The humans would provide adequate support for junior Cthulhu warriors while offering minimal risk to experienced fighters. Their colonies would make useful staging areas for future conquests deeper into the galactic rim. The squadron transmitted their intelligence reports to the Blood Hunter as soon as they entered Cthulhu communication range. Within hours, War Prime Zaxthal would have complete tactical intelligence on human capabilities and could begin planning the assault. That would add another conquered species to the Cthulhu Empire. Vextar had observed the systematic destruction of 17 different civilizations during his military career and he was confident that the humans would fall more quickly than most. Their peaceful nature and military unpreparedness would make the conquest almost routine, requiring more patience than skill from the Kithra assault force. War Prime Zakthal reviewed Commander Vextar's intelligence reports with the cold satisfaction of a predator selecting prey. The tactical data confirmed every assumption about human military weakness, and the conquest timeline would allow the Kithera to add human territory to their empire with minimal resource expenditure. Battlefleet Crimson would be sufficient to overwhelm human defenses, while the main Kithra Armada continued operations in more challenging sectors. Fleet Admiral Termaxis received orders to prepare his forces for immediate deployment to human space. The veteran commander had overseen the conquest of 47 different species during his military career, and the human campaign promised to be among the most straightforward he had ever conducted. His fleet of 800 warships represented his overwhelming superiority against the pathetic human forces described in the reconnaissance reports. The Kithra assault plan followed standard protocols that had proven successful against dozens of civilizations. Simultaneous attacks on all major human colonies prevent coordinated resistance while eliminating their industrial capacity. The primitive human communication networks would be jammed to prevent distress calls, and their small defensive fleets would be destroyed before they could organize effective counterattacks. Admiral Termaxis briefed his ship commanders on the expected resistance levels they would encounter during the human conquest. The assessment was so one-sided that several veteran officers expressed concern that the campaign would provide insufficient combat experience for junior warriors. The humans appeared to pose less threat than some pirate organizations the Kithra had eliminated. Target prioritization is straightforward, Termaxis explained to his assembled captains. Destroy orbital installations first to eliminate their limited defensive capabilities. Then proceed to surface bombardment of population centers. Standard doctrine applies. No survivors except for specimen collection and labor force requirements. Orders were transmitted throughout battle, Fleet Crimson with mechanical efficiency. Ship crews began final preparations for what promised to be the shortest conquest campaign in recent Kithra history. Weapon systems were charged, armor was polished, and warriors sharpened their claws in anticipation of close-quarters combat. With human defenders, Captain Velthara commanded the heavy cruiser Bone Crusher and had participated in more successful conquests than any other ship in the fleet. Her vessel's battle honors included victories against the Hegemony Alliance, the Astral Confederacy, and the infamous Nexus Swarm. The human campaign would be added to that prestigious list with minimal effort. The journey to human space took 12 standard days, during which the Kithra fleet maintained perfect formation and combat readiness. Long-range sensors detected no human activity that suggested awareness of the approaching threat. Their colonies continued normal operations, their patrol ships followed predictable routes, and their communication networks buzzed with peaceful civilian traffic. Battlefleet Crimson entered the outer edges of human territory without triggering any defensive response. The primitive human sensor networks failed to detect the approaching Kithera ships until they were already within striking range of the first target colonies. The tactical advantage was so overwhelming that Admiral Termaxis almost felt sympathy. For the doomed humans, the first attack commenced against the agricultural colony of New Darwin, the same settlement that Commander Vextar had observed during reconnaissance. 3 Kithera destroyers approached the defenseless world while broadcasting surrender demands in standard galactic languages. The human response was as pathetically predictable as expected. Unknown vessels. This is Colonial Administrator Sarah Chen of New Darwin, came the transmission from the human colony. We are a peaceful settlement engaged in agricultural development. Please identify yourselves and state your intentions. We welcome contact with other civilizations and invite you to establish diplomatic relations. Captain Velthara listened to the transmission with the casual interest of a predator, acknowledging prey that was still attempting to negotiate. The human administrator's voice carried no fear, no recognition of the mortal danger her people faced. The innocence was almost refreshing after decades of battles with species that understood the realities of galactic warfare. Human colony, you are now territory of the Kithera Empire, Velthera responded with standard conquest protocols. Surrender immediately and prepare for occupation. Resistance will result in complete elimination of your population. You have 60 seconds to comply. The human response revealed the depth of their military naivety. We are not familiar with Kithera Empire protocols. Please transmit your diplomatic credentials so we can arrange proper first contact procedures. Our government representatives will be happy to discuss any territorial concerns through established interstellar law. Interstellar law, diplomatic credentials, first contact procedures. The humans were attempting to apply peaceful civilian concepts to a military conquest situation. Captain Valthara had encountered naive civilizations before, but none that remained so completely oblivious to their circumstances even when, facing immediate annihilation, the 60-second deadline expired without human compliance, triggering automatic engagement protocols throughout Battlefleet Crimson. Kithora destroyers opened fire on the orbital installations around New Darwin with the precision and efficiency of a well-practiced military machine. The human defensive platforms were reduced to expanding clouds of debris within minutes. What happened next would be analyzed by Kithera tactical computers for years to come. The 3 human patrol boats defending New Darwin, instead of attempting to flee or negotiate further surrender terms, launched a direct attack against the Kithera destroyers. The assault was tactically suicidal and strategically meaningless, but it was executed with such ferocious determination that it caught the Kithora crews completely off guard. The human ships used ramming attacks, overloaded their reactor cores to create improvised nuclear weapons, and continued fighting even after their hulls were breached and their crews were dying. One patrol boat, its engines destroyed and life support failing, somehow managed to collide with a Kithera destroyer's weapon array, damaging systems that should have been impregnable. Captain Valthara watched the tactical display with growing confusion as her supposedly overwhelming forces struggled against 3 primitive human vessels. The humans were fighting with such desperate intensity that they were achieving tactical results far beyond what their technology should have made possible. Status report, Velthera demanded from her tactical officer as alarms blared throughout the Bone Crusher's command deck. How are 3 human patrol boats causing casualties among our destroyer squadron? The tactical analysis revealed something that violated every principle of warfare. The Kithora had mastered over 3 millennia. The humans weren't fighting to win, they were fighting to inflict maximum damage regardless of their own survival. Every tactical decision they made prioritized harming the enemy over preserving their own forces. The battle for New Darwin lasted 3 hours instead of the predicted 30 minutes. And when it ended, the Kithera had lost 2 destroyers and suffered damage to a 3rd. The human colony was destroyed as planned, but the cost had been far higher than anyone had anticipated. Most disturbing of all, similar reports were coming in from attack sites throughout human space. Admiral Termaxis stared at the tactical reports flooding in from attack sites across human space with growing disbelief. What should have been a routine conquest campaign was turning into the costliest military operation in recent Kithera history. Human resistance was not just fierce, it was completely irrational by every standard of galactic warfare. The assault on the mining colony of Kepler 442 had devolved into a nightmare scenario that challenged fundamental Kithera understanding of military logic. A single human freighter, converted hastily into a makeshift warship, had somehow destroyed 3 Kithora frigates by ramming them at full speed while broadcasting what could only be described as war songs over all communication frequencies. Captain, Mordok reported from the heavy cruiser Voidrender with barely contained frustration in his voice. Admiral, the humans at Kepler 442 are using industrial mining equipment as weapons. They've turned their entire colony into a fortress and are fighting from positions that should be indefensible. We've lost 2 landing parties to booby traps made from civilian construction materials. The reports from other battle sites painted similar pictures of humans transforming peaceful civilian infrastructure into weapons of war with terrifying creativity. Agricultural colonies were using fertilizer to create explosives. Research stations had weaponized their laboratory equipment. Even civilian transports were being converted into guided missiles with devastating effectiveness. Fleet. Admiral Termaxis reviewed casualty reports that defied every tactical projection his staff had developed. Battle Fleet Crimson had lost 47 ships during the first wave of attacks, with dozens more suffering significant damage. The humans, according to all intelligence reports, should have been capable of destroying perhaps 5 or 6 Kithra vessels before being completely overwhelmed. "Sir, we're receiving distress calls from Hunter Squadron Beta," reported Communications Officer Crixnell. "They encountered human patrol ships in the Centauri system and are requesting immediate reinforcement. 3 of their corvettes have been destroyed by what they're describing as suicide ramming attacks coordinated with nuclear detonations. The tactical situation was deteriorating beyond anything in Kithra military experience. Human forces were fighting with such desperate ferocity that they were achieving tactical results completely disproportionate to their technological capabilities. More disturbing still, their resistance was becoming more organized and effective. As the campaign progressed, War Prime Zakthal received Admiral Termax's situation reports from his command ship with growing concern. The human conquest was supposed to be a minor operation conducted by a secondary fleet, while the main Kithra armada remained focused on more significant campaigns. Instead, Battle Fleet Crimson was requesting reinforcements and extended operational timelines. "Explain to me how 300 human ships are inflicting casualty rates equivalent to campaigns against major galactic powers," Zakthal demanded during an emergency command conference. "Our intelligence indicated they possessed no significant military capabilities." The intelligence had been accurate as far as it went. Humans did lack advanced military technology, professional warrior castes, or sophisticated defensive strategies. What the Kithura had failed to recognize was that humans possessed something far more dangerous: the willingness to sacrifice everything rather than accept defeat. Commander Vextar, who had conducted the original reconnaissance mission, reviewed his reports with growing confusion. "War Prime, the humans are not fighting according to any recognizable military doctrine. They're using tactics that prioritize inflicting damage over self-preservation. They treat their own lives as expendable resources in service of harming the enemy." The concept was so alien to Kithra, thinking that it required extensive analysis to understand. Kithra warriors were conditioned to be aggressive and dominant, but they were also trained to preserve their own lives and equipment for future battles. Humans seemed to view combat as an all-or-nothing proposition where survival was secondary to victory. Battle reports from the assault on Earth's outer colonies provided the most disturbing intelligence of all. Human civilian populations were not fleeing from Kithira attacks or attempting to negotiate surrender terms. Instead, they were volunteering for military service in numbers that overwhelmed their own command structures. "The human homeworld has mobilized its entire population for military service," Admiral Termaxis reported. "Every civilian transport is being converted into a military vessel. Every industrial facility is switching to weapons production, treating our invasion as an existential threat requiring total response." The mobilization was unprecedented in Kithora experience. Most civilizations attempted to preserve their civilian populations and infrastructure during military conflicts, negotiating surrender terms when losses became unacceptable. Humans were transforming their entire society into a military machine focused on inflicting maximum casualties regardless of the cost to themselves. Captain Eltheres, encounter with human ground forces on the industrial world of New Manchester, provided tactical intelligence that challenged every assumption about human combat effectiveness. The battle report detailed 6 hours of urban warfare against defenders who used building collapses, improvised explosives, and coordinated ambush tactics to inflict devastating losses on Kithra assault troops. "They're fighting building by building, room by room," Velthera reported. "Every structure is booby-trapped. Every civilian is potentially armed. They're not attempting to hold territory, they're trying to kill as many of our warriors as possible before they die themselves." The urban warfare had cost the Kithira 300 elite warriors to secure a single city that intelligence had suggested would fall within hours. The human defenders had fought until literally the last person, using tactics that treated their own infrastructure as expendable. weapons rather than assets to be preserved, Warprime Zakthal faced a strategic dilemma that had no precedent in Cthulhu military history. The human conquest was consuming resources at an unsustainable rate while producing tactical results that fell far short of operational requirements. Continuing the campaign would require committing forces needed for more significant strategic objectives elsewhere. In the galaxy, the most disturbing aspect of the human resistance was its psychological impact on Cthulhu forces. Warriors who had conquered dozens of civilizations were reporting decreased morale and combat effectiveness after encounters with human defenders. The humans' willingness to die fighting was affecting Cthulhu battle psychology in ways that superior technology couldn't offset. Recommendation: immediate strategic reassessment of human threat potential. Admiral Termaxis concluded in his latest report, current casualty rates are unsustainable for extended operations. Human resistance exceeds projections by factors that suggest fundamental flaws in our intelligence analysis. The recognition was gradually dawning on the Cthulhu command structure that they had countered something unprecedented, a species whose military weakness was offset by psychological characteristics that made them far more dangerous than their technology suggested. The humans were prey that fought like predators, civilians who died like warriors, and a peaceful species that had somehow become the Cthulhu Empire's most costly military challenge. The siege of Earth had been underway for 6 months, and Warprime Zakthal found himself commanding the largest Cthulhu military operation in over a century. What was supposed to be a minor conquest requiring minimal resources had escalated into a full-scale campaign involving 3 entire battle fleets and over 2,000 warships. The human homeworld remained defiant despite overwhelming odds. The tactical situation around Earth defied every principle of warfare that the Cthulhu had mastered during their 3,000-year expansion across the galaxy. Human defenders had turned their entire solar system into a weapons platform, using asteroids as kinetic missiles, space stations as improvised fortresses, and even their own ships as guided bombs with terrifying effectiveness. Admiral Termaxis reported from the flagship Worldbreaker, with barely controlled frustration in his voice. Warprime, human resistance has actually intensified during the siege. They're launching attacks against our supply lines using civilian vessels converted into military platforms. Our casualty rates are increasing rather than decreasing as the campaign progresses. The intelligence was devastating to Cthulhu's strategic planning. Most civilizations became more willing to negotiate as the costs of resistance mounted, but humans seemed to become more determined to fight as their situation became more hopeless. Every tactical victory the Cthulhu achieved only seemed to increase human resolve rather than breaking their will to resist. Captain Althera commanded a destroyer squadron tasked with eliminating human orbital installations around Earth. The mission had been expected to take hours, but after weeks of continuous combat, the human platforms continued to inflict casualties through tactics that bordered on the incomprehensible. They're using their own space elevators as weapons, Velthara reported during the daily tactical briefing. When we approach the orbital terminals, they detonate the entire structure to create massive debris fields that damage our ships. They're destroying their own infrastructure rather than allowing us to capture it intact. The pattern was consistent across every battle site in the Sol system. Humans were prioritizing denial of resources over preservation of their civilization's achievements. They destroyed their own cities rather than allowing Cthulhu occupation, scuttled their ships rather than risking capture, and fought to the death in situations where surrender would have preserved lives. Commander Vextar had been reassigned to analyze human psychology in an attempt to understand their inexplicable behavior patterns. The research revealed disturbing insights into the species that the Cthulhu were attempting to conquer. Possessed cultural and psychological characteristics that made them fundamentally different from every Warprime. Human civilization appears to be built around concepts that prioritize abstract principles over individual survival, Vextar reported. They fight for ideas rather than territory, for concepts rather than resources. This makes their resistance patterns impossible to predict using standard tactical analysis. The psychological profile painted a picture of a species that was uniquely dangerous despite their technological limitations. Humans formed emotional attachments to other individuals, to their civilization, and to abstract concepts like freedom and independence that were stronger than their survival instincts. The siege reached a critical point when human forces launched what they called the Final Gambit, coordinated attack using every remaining military asset in the Sol system. The assault was tactically hopeless and strategically meaningless, but it was executed with such ferocious determination that it inflicted casualties the Cathura had never experienced during a siege operation. Fleet Admiral Morkith reported from his command ship as human vessels closed to ramming range while broadcasting messages that Kithra translators could barely comprehend. Warprime. They're transmitting what appear to be historical references and cultural symbols. They're fighting for concepts that don't exist in our language. The human attack wave consisted of converted civilian ships, hastily armed space stations, and military vessels that had been damaged beyond normal combat effectiveness. Every platform in the assault was essentially a suicide mission. But the humans executed their attacks with precision and coordination that suggested extensive planning and preparation. The battle for Earth orbit lasted 18 hours and cost the Cathura over 300 ships, while the humans lost everything they possessed. By any rational measure, the Cathura had achieved a decisive victory. But the psychological impact of the human sacrifice was devastating to Kithra morale and combat effectiveness. Warprime Zakthal reviewed the tactical reports with growing recognition that the human campaign had fundamentally changed the nature of Kithra warfare. His forces had achieved their objectives, but at costs that made victory feel like defeat. More disturbing still, the humans had demonstrated that technological superiority could be offset by psychological factors that the Cathera had never encountered. Casualty assessment: 40% of committed forces destroyed or damaged beyond immediate combat effectiveness, Admiral Termax reported. Operational timeline exceeded projections by 800%. Resource expenditure equivalent to campaigns against major galactic powers. The numbers were staggering and strategically unsustainable. The Cathora Empire was built on the principle of efficient conquest that allowed them to expand continuously without depleting their military resources. The human campaign had consumed more ships, warriors, materials than the conquest of the entire Hegemony Alliance. The final assault on Earth's surface revealed the ultimate expression of human resistance psychology: the planetary population, including civilians who had never received military training, fought with such desperate intensity that Kithra ground forces required 6 months to secure major population centers that should have fallen within days. Captain Velthara led the assault on the human capital city and encountered resistance that challenged every assumption about civilian behavior during warfare. Warprime. The humans have fortified every building, every street, every room. Children are operating weapon systems. Elderly civilians are conducting suicide attacks. Entire population has become combatants. The urban warfare on Earth became a nightmare that haunted Cathura warriors for the remainder of their military careers. Humans fought from positions that should have been indefensible, using weapons that should have been ineffective, and displaying tactical coordination that should have been impossible for civilians to achieve. The conquest of Earth was finally completed after 14 months of continuous combat. But the victory was Pyrrhic in every sense. The Cathira had suffered casualties equivalent to their losses during the previous decade of expansion combined. More importantly, they had discovered that military supremacy was not sufficient to guarantee efficient conquest against species with the right psychological characteristics. Warprime Zakthel stood in the ruins of the human capital, surrounded by the wreckage of the most costly military campaign in Cathira history. The humans were defeated, their homeworld occupied, their civilization apparently destroyed. But the Cathura had learned something that would change their empire forever. They were no longer the galaxy's most dangerous species. The victory celebration aboard the Kithra flagship was subdued in a way that Warprime Zakthal had never experienced during his centuries of military service. Battlefleet Crimson had conquered human space and occupied Earth, but the costs had been so devastating that the achievement felt more like survival than triumph. The galaxy's most feared military force had been brought to the edge of defeat by a species they had initially dismissed as harmless prey, Intelligence reports from across Kithra territory revealed the broader implications of the human campaign. Other species that had been considered potential targets for future conquest were studying the human resistance with intense interest. The Villani Republic had begun developing new defensive strategies based on human tactics. The Astral Confederacy was modifying their military doctrine to incorporate human-style psychological warfare. Admiral Termaxis reviewed casualty reports that would reshape Kithra's strategic planning for generations. War Prime, we have lost 60% of our committed forces. 3 entire battle fleets require complete reconstruction. Our warrior cadre has been reduced to levels not seen since the founding wars 3 millennia ago. The numbers were more than statistics. They represented the destruction of military power that had taken centuries to build. Kithra supremacy had been based on their ability to project overwhelming force while suffering minimal losses. The human campaign had shattered that strategic advantage and exposed fundamental weaknesses in their approach to galactic conquest. Commander Vextar presented the most disturbing intelligence from his analysis of human resistance patterns. War Prime, we have discovered evidence that human forces were not fighting at full capacity during our campaign. Intercepted communications suggest they were holding significant military assets in reserve, waiting for an opportunity to launch counterattacks against our home territories. The revelation that humans might have been capable of even greater resistance than they had displayed was profoundly unsettling. If the species that had nearly destroyed 3 Kithora battle fleets had been holding back resources, then the true extent of their military potential remained unknown and potentially catastrophic. Captain Velthara reported from her patrol duties in the outer regions of former human space. War Prime, we're detecting organized human survivor groups conducting guerrilla operations against our occupation forces. They're using the same tactics that made the initial conquest so costly, and they're teaching other species how to replicate human resistance methods. The guerrilla warfare was spreading beyond human survivors to include other species that had learned from observing human tactics. The Kithora were facing the possibility that their conquest of humanity had inadvertently created a tactical revolution that would make all future campaigns exponentially more difficult. War-Prime Zakthal received the most shocking intelligence from deep space. Monitoring stations, human ships launched during the siege of Earth as evacuation vessels, had established new colonies in unexplored regions of the galaxy. The human species had not been eliminated. They had been scattered across space where they could rebuild, beyond Kithora reach. Estimated human survivors, between 2 and 5 million individuals, distributed across approximately 40 different star systems, Admiral Termaxis reported. They possess industrial capacity sufficient to rebuild their civilization within decades. More importantly, they now possess combat experience against Kithira forces. The strategic implications were staggering. The Kithira had not conquered humanity. They had educated them about galactic warfare while dispersing them across the galaxy. They could develop in isolation. The scattered human colonies would eventually rebuild, but they would do so with full knowledge of Kithira capabilities and limitations. Fleet. Admiral Morkith discovered the most disturbing development while analyzing communication intercepts. From neutral space, or prime human survivors, are establishing contact with other species and sharing intelligence about our military operations. They're teaching alien civilizations how to fight effectively against Kithora forces. The humans were transforming from conquered prey into galactic insurgents who possessed detailed knowledge of Kithora weaknesses. Every battle they had fought during the conquest had provided them with intelligence about Kithora tactics, technology, and psychology that they could share with potential allies. The psychological impact on Kithora warriors was becoming evident in decreased combat effectiveness and increased reluctance to engage in ground combat operations. Troops who had conquered dozens of civilizations were reporting anxiety reactions and facing opponents who might use human-inspired tactics. Our warriors are afraid, Commander Vextar admitted during a classified briefing. They know that any enemy could potentially fight like humans, and they're not prepared psychologically for that level of resistance. We've built our military around the assumption that we're always the most dangerous species in any engagement. The assumption had been shattered by the human campaign. Kithra warriors now understood that military superiority could be overcome by psychological factors they had never encountered. The galaxy's most feared military force was learning to fear their opponents for the first time in millennia. War Prime Zakthal faced the most difficult decision in Kithra military history. The Empire could continue its expansion program, but every future campaign would be conducted with the knowledge that opponents might use human-style tactics. The costs would be exponentially higher, the casualties potentially unsustainable, and the psychological damage to Kithra military culture could be irreversible. The alternative was equally challenging, accepting that the Kithra Empire had reached the limits of its expansion and focusing on defending already conquered territories. The galaxy's most aggressive military force would have to transform into a defensive organization, abandoning the conquest-based economy that had sustained their civilization for thousands of years. Intelligence reports from neutral territories revealed that news of human resistance was spreading throughout galactic civilization. Species that had lived in terror of Kithra expansion for millennia were beginning to study human tactics and psychology. The humans had not just fought the Kithra, they had shown the galaxy that the galaxy's deadliest species could be defeated. As War Prime Zakthal reviewed the final reports from the human campaign, he realized that his forces had achieved a Pyrrhic victory that might ultimately prove to be their strategic defeat. They had conquered human space, but the humans had conquered something far more valuable: the fear that had made Kithra expansion possible. The galaxy's deadliest species had learned that they were now prey, hunted not by superior technology or greater numbers, but by the psychological revolution that humans had unleashed through their desperate resistance. The age of Kithra dominance was ending, replaced by an era where every species in the galaxy knew that even the most feared predators could be brought down by prey that refused to accept their